So we will return to it. And in fact, we return to belonging to at least touch on it again in the fourth level 4 as well. But just a refresher that creating a diverse workforce is totally futile if some people feel they're not accepted or that they have to cover parts of their personality. And this is true not just of racial identity, gender, but all different identities. Frankly, it's also true if you're a conservative and you feel you have to cover your identity. We don't want that for them either. So today we're going to make sure we truly understand what it means to belong and why it's so important for our species. We're going to dig into the biology and the evolution here, because belonging, and I've said this before, is the most powerful need a human being has after their survival is secured. The need to be belong, not ostracized, is remarkably strong. It motivates most of our behavior, over half. Humans naturally form groups and communities, and then they will place the needs of that community above almost all other needs. In one 1995 report, psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues said belongingness needs do not emerge until food, hunger, safety, and other basic needs are satisfied, but they take precedence over esteem and self-actualization. When we don't feel like we belong, we literally become ill. Lack of belonging, social isolation are really devastating to the human body and mind. Research has shown that having a rich social life makes you less likely to get cancer, less likely to suffer a heart attack. People who belong to a community live longer, they have less stress, they're more likely to say that their lives are meaningful. Loneliness can lead to not just ill health, but death. And it turns out the negative impacts of social isolation are tied back to that need to belong. It's primal. Not only is it disastrous when the need is not met, it's very beneficial when it is met. Now, I want you to frame this all with an understanding. There's all these things asking, if MAGA got what it wanted, why are they still so angry? If we start to reframe this into the ideas of these are people who do feel uncomfortable because of their identities and their beliefs, because of people who do not have a community, because many of the people who are part of MAGA, they may be part of a group, but that doesn't mean they're part of a community. Can they go to the Trump rallies? Are those people they could really call in the middle of the night if they had an emergency? Probably not. Studies from all over the globe show that social contact, as long as it's not hostile, can reduce your pain. It strengthens your immune system. The surgeon Atul Gawande, he said, without sustained social interaction, the human brain may become as impaired as one that has incurred a traumatic head injury. So I repeat that because it's so fundamental to understanding not just those who are part of marginalized groups, but it's fundamental to understanding those who are part of the dominant group. Belonging to a social group has helped our species almost from the very first appearance of Homo sapiens on the planet. It keeps us safe. It allows us to collaborate to take down larger animals like buffalo and lions. It also seems to have made us smarter. There's really good evidence that the rigors of dealing with other people forced our brains to expand. Apes who belong to larger communities have larger brains than those who live on their own. The need to belong might have originated many years ago as an efficient method to protect a species that was pretty much physically outmatched by almost all of its animal neighbors, including the mosquito, by the way, and also by the closest human relative, the Neanderthal. And since then, that this need has fundamentally changed our brains and our bodies. So we now cannot flourish without being part of a healthy social group. And that doesn't mean, and I've said this a bunch of times, you're probably sick of it, it doesn't mean we have to like each other to be healthy. Competition and argument are both natural, but there's this line when the competition goes too far, or when the argument becomes aggressive, when the argument threatens a person's identity. And again, obviously, we're talking about people in marginalized groups. We're also talking about why it's so difficult to talk to people who are part of MAGA. Because when their identity is threatened, it actually becomes harmful to them. It increases their physical pain. It makes them ill. Hostility is what determines the difference between healthy and not. So an interaction that's overwhelmingly angry or aggressive is probably not good for you. It's probably not good for the other person. Let's reel this back down from evolution to the more practical issues at the moment. This need to belong underlines a lot of our best impulses. It's probably what underlies empathy. And of course, empathy is crucial. Empathy in service of belonging is probably the underpinning of the basic moral code, right? You'll find a version of the golden rule in almost every major religion in history. And I'm not being rhetorical here. Literally, that golden rule, do unto others as you have them do to them, has a different version in nearly every single religion, even the tiny ones. But it requires a measure of empathy to do for others what we want for ourselves, right? It requires that we put ourselves in their place and wonder how they would want to be treated. So then you get things like love thy neighbor. And if you interpret that from an evolutionary point of view, it's an algorithm for social connectedness, right? The paleontologist Simon Morris said the touted virtues of chastity, moderation, compassion, diligence, patience, moral commitment, and humility provide touchstones for effective group action. So just this idea of belongingness, community, treating others as you would want to be treated is a way to bridge the gap even between those who are religious, faith-based and those who are not. Right? This is just the basics of how human beings get along with one another. You know, Darwin was really confused by altruism. He couldn't explain it from an evolutionary standpoint. He ended up arguing that altruism must be transactional, that we give to others expecting to get something in return. And I'm sure in some cases that's true, but I really don't think that's what underlies human generosity. Right? Do you? Do you think that human generosity can really be explained as transactional? What do we think? Jeremy?
Yes.
You do think that?
Not always.
Sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of can be used kind of in a transactional way. No permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, which I hate, but I realized it's not always false.
It's not always false, but I think, and this may be biased, I don't do transactional
Yeah,
um, generosity. I assume
Yeah.
neither of you, especially the work that you're in, I can't imagine that you do.
yeah, I don't agree. I think it has to be relational. And that's part of belonging as well, right? Like if it's not, I thought about what you just said about the brain, and you think about those in like countries like Africa and India and different places of poverty, the kids' brains are so small and they don't have that sense. There's no and belonging, if it affects your being so much, your actual physical being, and you don't have the transactional, maybe the relational part of a relationship where you feel like you can be yourself and that you can't flourish then. So yeah, and transactional is mostly there's a axiom sort of, I saw it like almost like a triangle, like the pyramid looking.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely transactional relationships are much more white. They're white people. That's how, like let me be nice to you,
Capitalism.
get something from you. Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I believe definitely has to be relational.
Um, what this all means is that because belonging is this universal need, because it's so powerful as a motivator, we can actually tap into it to better explain the value of DEI initiatives, right? To encourage cooperation. I want to play for you a video, which if you follow me on any of the social medias, you've already seen this. It's very short. Let me open it up here. This is Hakeem Jeffries on Friday. One second, I need to share my screen. Share. I'm not as fast at these things as I should be. Share sound. Okay.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. Perhaps I can explain. The motto of the United States of America is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That's diversity. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, one of the most important amendments in our country, provides equal protection under the law. That's equity. In this country, we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, a flag that we just presented to the new president and vice president. And in that pledge, we promise one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. ALL. That's inclusion. Not complicated. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are American values. It's about economic opportunity. It's about merit for everyone, based on what you know, not who you know.
Okay.
If only.
Yes. But, it's great for us all to learn about how to talk about these things in a way that, doesn't trigger people's defenses, right? That doesn't trigger that defensive response. And framing it within the idea of belonging is a really great way to do that. It looked like you're about to say something, Louise.
No, I mean, I believe everything he said, and I applaud it, and I feel deeply. But I think that so many of these people who want to be offended just because we exist hate it even when we speak or say something that is sage or correct. But I hear what you're saying, because what this does is it gives us the ability to speak, and it's not about pointing fingers. It's just about the reality. But I know so many people who don't even want to hear it.
So you'll remember probably in Alexis's class, you watched the video where they had everybody in the room and there was like, okay, who's bullied, right? And people step forward. Who was the bully, right? And had people step forward. I often will do that exercise at the beginning of a workshop. Why? Because I don't ask them anything about race. I usually don't ask about gender or sexual identity. I'll ask them things like, who was the class clown, right? Who ever cheated on a test? And what I'm doing is triggering people's sense of belonging that's not connected to the noise they hear all the time from politicians, right? You're helping people to understand inclusion from the sense of belonging, in that we all have felt left out at some point. Maybe it was in high school. Maybe it's your in-laws that make you feel like you don't belong in the family. It doesn't matter where it is. Everybody has that touchstone, that feeling of being excluded. And so we can talk about inclusion in terms of not making others feel excluded. And that means everybody. There's really solid research proving that it is possible to create an inclusive environment, but some of the tactics we've used in the past aren't helpful. Those things like the mixer events and the team building exercises, the retreats where everyone does a rope climb or whatever, they don't work. It's not surprising to anyone who's had to attend one. There's 3 things that are really effective in supporting a sense of belonging. We've mentioned them before, but I want to go over them again because it's important that we reframe them in terms of practicalities in our new environment. Perspective taking and giving, right? That's where you're encouraging people to hear each other's viewpoints. And this doesn't have to be about their personal lives. This can be about, okay, such and such went wrong. We're going to hear from everyone around the table about what happened from their point of view. That is perspective taking and giving. Encouraging, you can also be about your values, by the way. Here's the stated values of our organization. Let's talk about this. What does this mean? What does it mean to you? What do you think it means? How would you interpret this? The number 2 and number 3 are the most effective. They are encouraging membership, not only as a structured program, but as a subject of discussion. Asking people, how would you mentor someone who feels excluded? How would you coach them through this? Right? And then leadership ideas, where team members get the opportunity to individually come up on ideas on how they might make changes to a workplace to make it feel more welcoming to everybody. Some of the suggestions we've talked about that to build this sense of belonging are things we've mentioned in other things before. The structured mentoring, for example. And we're going to talk about reforming meeting practices, which can really help foster belonging. But you should also train people in a really useful skill, which is how to find allies and advocates at work. An ally in this sense, I'm not talking about, a male feminist. I'm talking about someone who acknowledges and includes you. And maybe that's your mentor. Maybe it's someone that you identify as being on your side. But allyship in the workplace or in any organization should be explicit. You should ask people if they're willing to be your ally. At BetterUp, you may know this company, the CEO said it can be as simple as having one person who you feel has your back, not even defending you, just including you. That's really enough to bring performance and pro-social behaviors back to normal levels. That's one of the most hopeful, exciting takeaways of our research. The beauty of the ally is that there's no hierarchy in the process. The ally can be a peer. There's something really empowering in the fact that everyone can be a leader in the company. If the job of a leader is to connect with a mission and bring their best selves to work, certainly managers have more of a megaphone, but every person in the company can be an ally to another and do the important job that leaders do. You can also intervene to support people who feel excluded. Researchers ran the simulation that showed how exclusion happens. And then they tested the effectiveness of asking an excluded team member, 1, what would they say to support someone else who's left out? 2, what would they change to make the situation more fair and inclusive and fun? 3, they asked them to read written reports by people who'd been excluded that also included how they worked through it all. All of those strategies helped people feel more of a sense of camaraderie with others. All 3 of those things. And again, let me go over them again. Asking people to consider, what would you say to someone who felt left out? What would you change to make a situation more fair, more inclusive and fun? And then finally, the process of reading descriptions, reports from people who had been excluded at some point, and that it included how they had worked through the experience, and then discussing. Would you agree with that? Do you think that's effective? What would you do differently? These are all really, really, I think, relatively simple solutions to tap into something that is so very, very powerful as belonging. Comments here before we move on? So there is the quiz, Belonging in the Workplace. Did any of you get the opportunity to take their quiz?
Yes, I did it. And I think I was 20 something. I was in that 16 to 30.
Oh, okay.
There's belonging, but there's, yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was about right.
That's not bad. Yeah. The 20 to 30 is, I mean, that's relatively in the middle, right? The score says you mainly feel safe and valued, but there's still room for improvement. Your main opportunity is remembering that feeling like you belong doesn't mean work will suddenly be a walk in the park, right? That's not a score of 30 and above, which is a really good, strong sense of belonging. Did you take it, Laurice? Too much going on.
Wait, no, I did not. I'm sorry. I keep muting myself and then forgetting to unmute.
I do it all the time. Yeah. So how about do you have pen and paper or a writing utensil with you? Let's take it really fast for you.
Okay.
So we can get your reaction. And I can read these too.
Let me get my pen.
These questions.
Pen.
Oh, she's getting a pen.
Getting my pen. Okay.
So this first one, and it's going from 1 to 7, 1 being strongly disagree, 7 being strongly agree.
Yep.
Okay.
1, 2.
Oh, those all say 1. Sorry about that.
I know 1, 2, 3.
There's only 5 questions.
Okay, so 7. 11.
Whew. Okay, so here is your description of score of 0 to 15.
Wait a minute. I did something wrong. I do
Okay.
feel safe because wait. So
Did
I
you do it
generally feel that
opposite?
people accept me in my organization, strongly agree. And
Okay.
then I feel like a misplaced piece. I strongly disagree.
Okay, so far your score is 8,
Okay. I would like to make a difference.
but I don't feel what I have
That would be
offers.
strongly disagree. I would like to make a difference, yes, but I strongly disagree. I do
So your
have what
score is 9.
yeah. I feel like an outsider, strongly disagree. I'm uncomfortable that my background, I strongly disagree. So yeah.
Oh, it did. Oh, I see. It says step 1, 2, 3, 4 are reverse scored. So you subtract your answers from 8 and then you add them up to get a subtotal. You are actually in the top score here of more than 30. You feel a strong sense of belonging. You feel you can usually share your thoughts and know you'll be respected and heard.
Mhm.
So all of this is to say that this is a quiz you can share with you, and there's easier versions. I need to fix their numbering there. It is in your workbook, but this is something you can share with your team and get their reading as well. Do they feel as though they belong?
Mm,
If you really want them to be honest, you can make it anonymous,
right.
and go from there. But starting from this place of assuming that everyone should belong also means that you can't let any dominant personalities set the tone for what is considered cool, what is considered admirable. And what happens very often in organizations is that you'll get some people who are popular, right? People like them, they think they're smart, and those people's personalities sort of set the tone in terms of what's praised and what is ostracized within an organization. And the kicker here is that a lot of times that's not the leaders, that's not the managers. It's just whomever they are in the organization that other people like and like to hang out with. In your workbook, there is the copy of an article that's called What Happens When You Tell Your Story and I Tell Mine. Because it's in your workbook, it wasn't part of your homework. But he talks about, it's from Greater Good magazine, and Greater Good, I've mentioned before, absolutely phenomenal research center at Berkeley. And they have so many resources there. They've got exercises and games, all kinds of stuff you can find for pretty much anything you'd like to do with your organization. But he tells the story. Have either of you heard of the book Black Like Me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Incredibly problematic, right? So and the photos of him painted to look black are just so cringy. But on the first page of that book, he says, how else except by becoming a Negro could a white man hope to learn the truth? The Southern Negro will not tell the white man the truth. He long ago learned that if he speaks a truth unpleasing to the white will make life miserable for him. The only way I could see to bridge the gap between us was to become a Negro, as though painting your face would make you a Negro. But what he did, if you took out all the problematic parts of it, which is almost all of it, what he was really doing was perspective taking. I don't agree that African Americans won't tell you the truth. I just don't think they're going to tell you the truth when you walk up to their house and knock on the door. I think you have to give them a reason to trust you. But perspective taking means being able to see the point of view of somebody that is part of an out group, right? His audience Stokely Carmichael, right, said that Black Like Me is an excellent book for whites. His audience was not Black people, right? It was white people. It was meant to be a bridge for white people who literally couldn't hear African Americans, couldn't, because their unconscious bias was so overwhelming, they couldn't even hear them. And it many times was very powerful to that extent, as problematic as it was. As much as I cannot stand that book personally, it did a lot of good. There's no getting around that. There were white people who were convinced to at least listen, to at least acknowledge that they might be prone to unconscious bias, to at least acknowledge that Black people might be getting a raw deal, and at least be open to the idea that they might want to listen to others who didn't look like them. That's pretty powerful. And I say this because all the time when we are doing this work and when we think about belonging and inclusion, we try to not bring people into the fold who aren't doing it exactly the way we want them to do it.
Mhm.
And history shows us that an imperfect bell still rings. And even if somebody only moves us forward half an inch, it's forward, right? Even if all they're doing is preventing us from sliding backwards, that can be seen as progress.
Mhm.
And I want us to get used to celebrating those small victories of anything that increases the opportunity for including others. When a perspective has been marginalized, it's important to allow that one to come forward first, right? And then for members of the dominant group to then take that in entirely before they give their own in return. That's one thing that book did, because obviously they weren't giving their own perspective in return. They were taking it in. The research that has been done on perspective taking it's not just about belonging and increasing sense of community, but it's really gives us a framework for understanding how to negotiate differences. Perspective taking isn't really the same thing as empathy. We think of emotional empathy, right? Emotional empathy is the ability to recognize someone is feeling something, accurately identify what it is that they're feeling, and imagine what it would be like if we were in that situation. So in 2019, a bunch of scientists tried to test the impact of empathy on polarization in the United States. So they took a whole bunch of survey data, they boiled it down to see how people who had higher scores for empathic concern would feel towards people in the other party. And they measured things, many of that were absolutely great metrics, things like how much distance they kept in terms of physical difference, social distance, but also things that were more their opinions, like what would you feel if a family member married? How would you feel if one of your family members who you loved married a Republican? How would you feel? I'm asking. Yeah.
I would not be thrilled.
Would you go to the wedding?
Yeah, I'd go to the wedding if I love someone, because I have to hope that a Republican can have their mind changed just like anyone else.
What about you, Audrey?
Depends on the Republican, mind you, as well.
What if they're a MAGA Republican?
I'd have to think about it, because I'd have to think about who else might be there. I mean, if we're saying MAGA Republican Trump,
Yeah.
would I go? And if someone I loved were doing that, I hope that we would be able to. I don't know that I would go.
Audrey?
I have family who is Republican.
MAGA
And-
Republican?
Hmm?
MAGA Republican?
Well, they still voted for him this time because God over everything.
Were they black or white or something else?
They're
perhaps? Ah,
black. They're, conservative Christians. And I mean, I haven't talked to my aunt and her daughters and their husbands, and I haven't talked to them since. My mom is able to just, oh, we just don't talk about it. And I don't know what, I mean, we don't talk that often anyway, but I just haven't, there's a new grandchild and I just can't, because she has to know better. I don't know. I heard that my grandmother was Republican, but she still voted for Carter and Obama. I don't think she would have voted for this guy.
Audrey, would you go to the wedding?
So the first thing I thought about was, is it the MAGA or is it, a true Republican? I don't think that MAGAs are Republicans. I think it's
I agree.
So we have on the family's a mixed family, so we do have MAGA people in Michigan that are white. And they're just as nice. As a matter of fact, the daughter is married to a Mexican American. I don't understand it. And somehow they can get past it. And my best friend has two families, a white family and a black family. The white family are all about Trump. The lawyer, one of them is a lawyer and went to Pitts, that whole Philadelphia thing that happened, and the lawyers went, and then they all got shut down. David was in there. He was one of the lawyers. Um, yeah. So, and we know that the history of America, like blacks were Republicans for a long time,
Yeah.
right? So, um, yeah, I don't think that MAGA people are Republicans. I think, and I have a difficult time with the Republican point of view, but this is different. Would I go to the wedding? I would go. I don't know if I'd go to the reception and party with them and stuff like that. But um, um, it would be difficult knowing all the things that are happening now. But this situation that's happening now is beyond it's extreme, and yeah, this is a whole different situation.
I think in some ways it could be said, would you go to a wedding if someone married a Nazi? Based on the behavior, based on the actions, based on they've killed people and gotten away with it. I mean, it is what he's setting up now is going to kill people. The
Yeah,
lack of
pretty immediately.
humanity, how, I mean, truly, it is, would we go and support a Nazi? I want to hear what would you say, or do you give your opinion in these
Me, oh
moments?
yeah, I'm happy to give my opinion. Uh as long as my physical safety was insured, I would probably go, but I would let the person know that it had me questioning my relationship with them. Um, you know, that who you love says a lot about what you value. And I wish them all the best, but it would really have me feeling like I would need to step back. That's probably what I would tell them. And I would not be inviting them probably to any intimate dinners, maybe to a larger party. I would. It would be tough. And that's what they found in their study, was that although those who were high for empathy and empathic concern weren't uncomfortable with people who disagreed, like they didn't feel a high level of discomfort, but they were way more negative in terms of inclusion, much more likely to leave them out of events, much more likely to censor their speech and try to prevent them from speaking. That means that emotional empathy is not particularly useful in reducing polarizations. And in fact, it can make things worse.
So I will say something. So that's me personally, but it's interesting because someone said, well, someone shouldn't be in your archive because they think this way. I said, no, this isn't emotional for me about who's in the archive. If you're Black and this is your history, whether I like it or not, it is included here because if we change that, then we become no better or maybe even worse than others who've excluded us from the narrative. So I'm not looking to ever exclude anyone from the narrative. It's just my personal comfort in a moment
Yeah, but
life
in
way.
this particular study, we're not talking about business or an
Okay.
organization. We're talking
Yeah.
about your personal life.
Okay.
It turns out that people who have a lot of emotional empathy tend to feel it more towards in groups, the people we have compassion for, right? The people who are like us, the people who have suffered. If we think of ourselves as being marginalized, we're going to have more compassion for those who have been marginalized.
Mhm,
We
mhm.
feel less empathy for those who are really different from us, and especially for the dominant group. If our in group is attacked by that other group, your empathy doesn't help you. Now, I'm not confusing emotional empathy, which is, your gut, that's an emotion, with perspective taking. And that's where we get into what you're talking about here, Laurice, which is perspective taking asks us to do the very conscious, intentional, cognitive work of taking the viewpoints of opponents, even if you don't feel any warmth toward them. And one of the researchers says empathic concern is an emotional form of empathy, while perspective taking is a cognitive form of empathy. That is, empathic concern involves reacting to another's suffering with feelings of sympathy or compassion. In contrast, perspective taking doesn't involve an emotional reaction to another person's situation. The goal isn't to feel what they're feeling, it's to understand, at least intellectually, why they feel the way they do. Which doesn't mean your empathy is useless, obviously. Empathy is the basis of everything we're talking about today in terms of belonging and community. Empathy is the foundation of that. But we just have to be cognizant of its downsides, its limitations. We tend to feel empathy for those who are like us. We don't feel empathy for others. And I have seen a lot of very progressive liberal people saying horrible things about MAGA Republicans, saying, they hope they're the first ones to starve, when the food assistance is cut. None of us can condone that. There are a lot of really great research projects that come from this perspective of, and a lot of them are based around war zones, right? To understand how can we make it easier and more lasting to see things, to at least try to understand the other person's vested interests, right? When we get these research projects and they involve Black and white kids, what you see is that the white kids get a lot out of it. Like they start to hear things they've never heard before. But the kids of color got almost nothing out of it. And that's partly because, look, if you are a person of color, you're exposed to their points of view all the time. So this researcher who's sort of the expert on this, he spent his career doing this, he said that his hypothesis became that perspective taking doesn't work for members of a marginalized group. So what he did is he brought together a couple pairs of groups in his original study between Mexican immigrants and white Americans. He did another one that involved Israelis and Palestinians, although that's completely out the window now. And he put them through a whole series of experiments in terms of perspective taking and perspective giving. Sorry, I have a lozenge in my mouth. I have COVID. He didn't get a lot of interaction in the Middle East, right? But in the US, he did. The attitudes of the dominant group actually improved significantly after hearing their perspective. The chance to give their perspective also helped the marginalized groups, just the ability to be heard. Just that, being heard and being allowed to speak of their own perspective, actually made them see the dominant group in a more positive light. And what he found was really similar results, in fact, from both experiments, both the one in the Middle East and the one in the US. Perspective giving is more valuable to marginalized groups. Perspective taking is more valuable for the dominant group. Now, if this is in practice, it's best for both people to do both, but you need to let the marginalized group go first. That is what's going to serve the needs of both sides. All of this, by the way, is laid out in the article in your workbook. We're just going through it because it's so crucial here in terms of moving forward in our, I went and redid this, basically touched on everything in this entire course because we live in a new world now. So there was a really lovely program in Tennessee, the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Coalition. I can't remember now. They had a program that was called Welcoming Tennessee. And what they were trying to do was figure out how to integrate immigrants into neighborhoods and communities. And their whole strategy was based on sharing stories, sharing perspectives. And they found that the climate in Nashville, which is where they're based, changed dramatically in just a few years. In 2009, there was a ballot initiative that would require all government documents be conducted in English only. But within the year, because of Welcoming Tennessee, the ballot measure failed. 57% of voters came out against it. In 2014, they opened an office specifically targeted toward helping immigrants and refugees acclimate. And they now have a whole program called Parent Ambassadors, where they have all these volunteers, people who come from the same country as whoever the refugee or immigrant is, and they help them navigate. We were talking about this before in terms of what you can do within your own organization, right? The onboarding process, having people get paired up with someone who helps them navigate, figure out where the copy paper is, right? How you put in a travel request, how you do all these other things. It's now become a national initiative. Since 2010, I don't remember, like maybe 2010, it's now called Welcoming America. And what they do is they find those influential people, like I was talking about before. Some of them are officials, some of them are, more successful refugees themselves. And they help them move them across that, they call it a welcoming spectrum. They're trying to get people from fearful to the middle point is tolerant. And then the other end of the spectrum is welcoming. And this is all based on letting people tell their stories and have their stories be heard. It is, we're about to take a break here, but this is how important when it comes to belonging. This is where it begins. We aren't hearing one another's stories. Okay, we have just a few minutes before, like 5 minutes before a break. Questions or comments? There's other examples. And there's also, just really quickly, in the workbook, I put in 3 suggested exercises. I just want to make sure that you understand what they are so that you can use them if you feel like it. The first one is called I Am You. You pair people up. You give everybody just a couple minutes to note down positive qualities in the other person, right? Then you're going to take turns speaking as that other person and introducing yourself. Like I would say, hi, I'm Alexis Richardson. I am mission driven and I am dedicated and I am insightful. And, I would introduce myself. I'm detail oriented. I'm friendly. I have a lovely, very opinionated daughter. You have them introduce themselves as the other person. And that's as far as it goes, extremely simple. The other one is mind mapping. And you can use a whiteboard. This is essentially where you're doing a radiant thinking exercise, but doing it as a group, right? So you're going to put the word belonging in the middle, and then you're going to have everyone shout out the words that come to mind when I say belonging. And then, let's say that one of them is inclusion, right? Then you say, okay, shout out the words that come to mind when you say inclusion, and you're going to create this mind map. And the final one is common ground, where again, you pair people up, set a timer for 5 minutes, have them write down everything they have in common with the other person. And then you can give a bag of M&Ms for the person who had the longest list. Then shuffle them up and have them do it again. They will find out they can find something they have in common with every single person in the room. But it's a great way to foster a sense of belonging. It is that exercise of, step forward if you've been bullied. And you can give them a list of possible questions like that. Who's ever been to Yellowstone? Who's ever been divorced? You can give suggestions. So, all right, we have 4 minutes left. Questions or comments before we take a break?
I'm just happy you're doing this. This is great. I added the B to our DEIBA, so it's
Oh,
diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and access. I added the BA,
that's excellent.
even though we're going to take it out and do something different, but
I
anyway.
know.
Okay.
We're going through that process right now.
So it's great. Thank you so much. This is really important.
Yeah, I always want to give you real life practical things you can try out. And you can always call me out if you're like, what the hell, how do I make this actually happen in my own organization? Because that's our goal, is always, I want everyone to leave every single session going, okay, I have some things I know I can try.
So
Any other?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
one thing. So you know how we're not using the word inner city anymore? Do you know what word we're using for that? What phrase or what?
It kind of depends. I can send you a guide. I spent like 9 or 10 months researching dog whistles. And I made a long list of things that are dog whistles, and then alternatives to them. Usually what we say in terms of inner city is we'll do it in terms of either income, low income, et cetera, et cetera. You can say you can say urban environment instead of urban person. You're going to talk about very specific qualities that could refer to pretty much anyone who lives there, regardless of their religion, color, etc. You can also say metropolitan. You can say near the downtown area as opposed to suburban, although we keep away from that. You can also say non-rural.
Could you say underserved? But that doesn't refer to city.
Yeah, that's a different thing. You can be underserved and live in the middle of Alaska.
Yeah.
Right. You can say densely populated.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're just going to use those words that describe where it is that they're living.
Right. Very good. Thank you so much.
Because there's other things we can't use, right? We can't use welfare, economic anxiety, silent majority. These are the phrases that actually have been proven to trigger people's subconscious biases. Decent people.
I heard someone talking about ghetto the other day.
Oh my God, what is this, 1960? Model minority, heartland.
Model minority.
When you can't say, you're not supposed to use the middle class.
Oh.
As opposed to just middle class values, because what is the middle class? It's not even useful, right? It doesn't even, who is that person? That doesn't refer to anything, right? So there's all kinds of them. Section 8, no. All right. Civilized society, no. So there's all kinds of alternatives to those. Feel free to shout them out and I'll give you alternatives.
Thank you.
It is 4:00 in my time zone. Wherever you are, we will take 8 minutes as a break. And I know it's been a rough week. It's been a long year. And be back here at 8 minutes past the hour. See you then. Don't remind me to turn the recording back on. Recording back on. And I saw your note about taking a call, Larry. So it's all good.
Okay. We've got someone
Okay.
who's upset in the neck.
So, it sounds like neither of you got a whole lot of time to read the homework, which is obviously okay. But
I
one of the
usually
home,
would, and I didn't, though. I apologize because I know it helps me to do more.
it's all okay. The first reading material in this area was called Avoiding Racial Equity Detours. Now, the guy who wrote that, Paul Gorski, is the one who basically invented this field of study, and he was talking about education. But there's two kinds of detours that he talks about there. The first refers to institutional detours that take organizations away from the path to equity. The second is focused on personal detours. Now, my question before we get started on this is, how do you think they overlap? Do you think that personal detours, the things that pull an individual away from pursuing equity, ever become organizational detours?
I think
You repeat
if I
that?
heard you correctly, I think so. Can you repeat it?
Yep. So the two different detours he's talking about are institutional and personal. Do they ever overlap? In other words, can a personal detour, meaning something that pulls you away from pursuing equity or justice, can that ever become organizational?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Especially if, because you're going to go to work and find people that think the way you think. And then that's going to become that connection can, you know, if you're, let's say you're dominant in that feeling, and then more of you feel that way, then that's how it's going to be. It's going to change. It could change the culture, or it'll affect the culture, definitely.
So we're going to talk about these 4 detours he identified. The first one he called pacing for privilege. The comfort of some is threatened by change, right? And in this detour, that comfort is prioritized. Let's meet people where they are. Let's find the least offensive language possible, right? We can see how making small tweaks to accommodate somebody's comfort can never end until you're basically eliminating any discussion of slavery or gay marriage, right? Pacing for privilege, where everything gets slowed down to the point that it's almost stopped completely because at some point it makes someone uncomfortable. Have we seen evidence of this in our organizations? I know we've seen it in our politics, but
I was just going to say.
the second one is called poverty of culture. And in this, systemic racism and inequity are talked about as cultural issues. Sorry, I just swallowed down a bunch of Fresca and now I need to burp. Okay, I want to read you what Paul Gorski says about poverty of culture. He says, although racial identities may inform cultural identities, racial inequities are not predominantly cultural misunderstandings. Racism is a tangled structural mess of power, oppression, and unjust distribution of access and opportunity. This mess cannot be resolved with greater cultural awareness alone. Things like disparities in wages, in criminal justice, in rank are not a function of culture. Now, there's another problem with, the culture wars. There's another problem with this poverty of culture is that well-meaning, I was about to say well-meaning white women, but it is very often well-meaning white women will try to fix what are systemic problems by fixing someone's culture, right? Even Bill Cosby tried to do this by scolding young Black men about wearing their pants too low. Wearing your pants too low. I personally don't want to see anybody's underwear, but that's not going to fix systemic racism, right? We had a long period of time in which Black people, Hispanic and Latino people, Asian American people tried to assimilate, did exactly what they thought that the dominant culture expected of them, and it didn't do a good goddamn thing. So this idea that they're connected, that you can fix racism by fixing culture, that you can have a Taco Tuesday, and that's helping you get to progress, is a real detour, right? You can see detour to me is a really great word for this because we're still moving. We've gone off the path. And this happens a lot when organizations, especially, set up these cultural awareness events. Comments here?
It's kind of triggering to talk about because it's so prevalent in our politics and our, you know, organizations. Like,
It's painful. The third one is the deficit ideology detour, in which people will try to address inequity by trying to fix the marginalized person, right? Teaching a woman how to negotiate like a man, because that's going to fix the wage gap. Telling women they make less because they take positions in nursing or teaching, right? RFK Jr.
Hi,
telling Black
Zuckerberg.
telling Black people to make kids resilient against racism. And the way you do that is by giving them a great education so they know they have potential. And the other thing is to give them business model role models and opportunities within their own neighborhoods. Black men who are running barbershops, who are running bars, who are running dance studios, who are running local business restaurants and are part of that community. This is this deficit ideology detour, where you recognize that there is injustice, you recognize that there are gaps in opportunity and protection, but you think that here's this gap and you make it up by fixing the marginalized to make up the gap, not that the dominant is actively pressing the marginalized down. This was the approach to racism in the United States, the most common approach to racism in the United States for well over a century after the Civil War. They sent all these well-meaning, I hate to pick on well-meaning white women. They did a lot of good, but they sent these well-meaning Methodist and Protestant women into the South to teach in Black schools and try to teach them about hygiene and how to be good Christians, right? And the last detour is the celebrating diversity detour. And this is a focus on events that help white people learn about other cultures without ever confronting racism. And that derails efforts for reform because it helps people learn about diversity and not racism. In this, non-white colleagues are often used as props in this education initiative. Gorski says this allows white people to opt out of considering racial justice while deriving social and cultural benefits from diversity awareness. It creates the illusion of diversity appreciation while entrenching inequality. Are you still feeling triggered, Alexis?
I mean, yeah, but it's fine. There are worse things happening.
So the great thing about the materials that I sent you and what we're going to talk about now is that there are fixes for these things. We're going to continue to talk about more detours because Paul Gorski was talking about schools, the school setting. There are other scholars, especially scholars of color and women, who have done research to identify the detours that happen within businesses, within organizations. In your packet of materials, you'll find racial equity detours in higher education. And this was a report from 2 female professors who analyzed DEI efforts and then identified 5 other obstacles. The first one was the white rage detour. So if you remember that video of Dr. Carol Anderson talking about the history of white rage and how it has to be acknowledged and understood before we can make progress, the authors of this report wrote, by white rage, we mean the rage that manifests in white people when Black advancement is pursued, and ways that white people will stop that advancement by any means necessary, and most often via rules, policies, and violence. This is exemplified by a comment made by a college-level colleague during a meeting in which we are examining our vision and values. They said, I'm concerned that the important broad message about fairness and equity, on which I think there's wide agreement, is being overshadowed by the trumpeting of a liberal agenda. So that comment is really similar to what Gorski talked about in terms of the culture of poverty, where there were issues of racism avoided through the use of terminology that's more palatable to people who are not anti-racist and their allies. But there is, they say, something deeper going on here. We believe this is a point where direct confrontation with racist ideology sparks white rage in some white people. For our colleague to mention a liberal agenda when politics were never broached speaks to the politicization of a topic when there were no mentions of politics before. By naming racism for what it is based on Bell's 26, Bell Hooks 26 tenets of critical race theory, that racism is part of the fabric of the country. This colleague wants to name politics as the source of consternation versus disagreeing with racism doing what it normally does. And the fear of that white rage, the rage has been weaponized, where people overreact and really let their rage go. And there has become a fear of triggering it. That's definitely true in a lot of nonprofits, where they hamper themselves in advance. I don't know if you saw that Colonial Williamsburg took down their entire website that included the history of the Revolutionary War, because the historians that they had gotten over years worth of time and research and work had included the history of indigenous peoples' role in the Revolutionary War and how slavery was involved in all of that. And so they took the entire thing down. Why? Because they were afraid of white rage. Obedience in advance, right? The next one they identified was the take no risks detour. So the authors in here described this meeting that they had with an administrator when he asked them to take down the website of their diversity council because the language might be off-putting to some students or parents. Only four out of five members of the council pushed back on that request. And they wrote, questions were asked about how everyone thought the meeting went. One person said, "I've never had a meeting with him, so I just wanted to listen." Another person said, "I'm quiet because I'm still very much a learner. This isn't my area of expertise." The faculty members who spoke took risks. They pushed back to defend the principles that the whole council had agreed upon. And that administrator had a direct impact on their future success, right? Especially if they were on tenure track. Some colleagues were perfectly comfortable watching other people speak out, but not willing to take that risk and stand up with the rest. That's the take no risks detour. When someone is on board, they agree with the principles, but they will only do it if there's no risk involved. The next one is let's be nice. The author said this is the most common of all the detours that was identified in the data. They write, it was used when race and racism were positioned as being divisive or controversial and threatened the perceived equilibrium of professional culture. Division speaks to the luxury of not having to deal with the division that's already present for faculty who've been marginalized. The additional issue is there's an idea that anti-racism can be something that is passive and comfortable versus active and uncomfortable. This is kind of similar to pacing for privilege, but it's different in that it's less focused on the timeline of progress, the pacing, and it's more on the interpersonal discourse, that everything has to be discussed in a nice way. Be civil, right? I don't like your tone. The next one is the performance detour, performative allyship, where people are allowed to publicize their commitment to anti-racism without actually investing anything in fighting for it. They're attending cultural diversity events. They're joining DEI committees that are only serving in an advisory capacity. This can actually be seen in efforts to learn about diversity and equity without ever taking action or ever being held accountable. Because in the end, it's accountability that matters. And finally, there's the refusal to learn detour. And let's talk about this one a little bit. This refers to the people who bypass every opportunity to learn about DEI issues and then block action by saying they don't understand the terms or the issues or the reasoning behind some of the efforts. Bye, Alexis. Now, the authors give an example. They schedule in their department, they scheduled bi-monthly meetings that are open to every person in the department, right? They've been holding those meetings for 5 years. They also have they also stage a whole bunch of college-wide events and programming all year long to learn about anti-racism. So as they were having these discussions about anti-racist principles, a person who hadn't attended a single one of those events or meetings said they needed to understand the concept of anti-Blackness before they decided, because a Black student believed, they said, one of my Black students thinks this idea of anti-Blackness stereotypes what it means to be a Black person. It's possible their Black student actually said that, but not likely. The most harmful is that the Black student reference here was made a scapegoat, right? If it was true. Instead of this professor was just blatantly using a Black student to confirm their own biases. Terms and ideas are up for healthy debate, absolutely. But this particular line of questioning where you've put no effort into learning about it and then are holding up progress like a block in the sewers, it is a real problem, because these debates only take place when there's actual action and accountability at stake. In other words, the meaning of anti-Blackness had been discussed for 5 years. And also within safe spaces like a study group that person was invited to and never attended. And then they said, I don't understand the meaning of this when it came time to decide on action. And they slowed the entire process down. And they were a powerful member of the department. They set the tone and ended up undermining years of work. One of the authors wrote this, and I think it's important. She said, we need to be careful assuming that our only enemy are the conservatives. We should watch for the progressive white people who say they are about equity and anti-racism, but when the rubber meets the road, they seek to maintain status quo. Okay, so those are the different equity detours that have been identified through data. We're going to talk about the evidence-based solutions for these things. Gorski laid out 5 of them, and you should see in the workbook. Oh, maybe they're not in the workbook. I guess I better fill that in. I'll have to fix that. He has the direct confrontation principle, the redistribution principle, prioritization principle, fix injustice, not people. There's 5 of them, and won't go through them because he lays them out really, really well in his article. But I do want to talk about, because the longer report is the one that was written by Glass and Miller, those 2 women, I do want to talk about a couple of their solutions, because that report's quite long. So let's boil this down for you here. Their first solution is to find your people or find your person. We've had countless conversations about our identities, who we are not, what our boundaries and limitations are, how to maintain our own well-being, and how that contributes to collective identity as anti-racists, right? People who work towards equity. We know how to lift each other up and call each other in if we need to be corrected, right? We're fully aware we're not perfect. We try to be better every day. We love one another. We support and respect each other. We watch each other's backs. We know we are each other's person. This is common among our groups. We proofread each other's emails. We plan talking points. We believe every person doing racial justice at their institution should have at least one person in their corner. So find that person and lean on them. The second solution is a return on investment. They say, we're often sought out to support anti-racist endeavors in our college campus and community. Although we learned it the hard way, we now investigate more carefully every request to see if it's a good use of our time and its resources. There are people who just want to perform anti-racism and are not truly vested in the work. Those people no longer get any of our time. We must see a return on our investment from the outset. We look to see, we ask the hard questions, we follow up. An intentional strategy of anti-racists is to exhaust those who are doing the work. When we begin to see equity detour behavior, they say, we name it. And we ask what the plan is to do something about the detours that are happening. We are intentional to discern who may be trying to deplete or exploit us, and we stay away from them and their initiatives. Third, create our own space. They say, we love to dream about what an anti-racist space might look like. So we create those spaces for ourselves. We attend events where scholars who are already doing the work we want to do are talking about those spaces. We collaborate with others. We're constantly applying for funding to support these endeavors. We have carved out a niche in which to grow. And finally, stay in community. We don't know it all. We don't claim that we do. We understand there's power in solidarity, and white supremacy would prefer that disruptors work in isolation. Therefore, we find the community who's doing anti-racist work and stay in community with them. We pursue the community agencies who are doing the work we want to do. We support them with an institutional relationship. We join organizations that are contributing to dismantling oppression. We walk in solidarity with folk who will also hold us accountable. And we intentionally speak out folks who feed our soul. We're about to go a little deeper into some of these detours. Any comments on these? You may notice that all of theirs are on supporting their well-being as solutions, as opposed to changing other people's behavior. Thoughts?
They seem like they have a little bit of self-care in there to help buffer all of this, because this is all really,
Yeah.
really,
Because you heard Alexis that she felt upset.
yeah, it is, it's triggering. Yeah, so and that's something that people are really concerned about now. Like, I'm actually thinking of taking a day or two off, and it's hard to take a day or two off at the foundation, but it's like there's just too much. It's a lot. And if you don't stop the merry-go-round, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going.
Yeah. A friend of mine, Alicia Montgomery, she's in Mexico right now. I mean, she's got a Black special needs kid. Like, she was afraid to be in DC for the inauguration.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You know,
Yes.
how can you blame her?
Can't.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about digging into that concept of cultural awareness versus actual anti-racism, because this is so common in organizations. And sometimes people with the best of intentions organize cultural awareness events, not realizing that it's a detour, right? A common equity development framework is cultural competence. But this is an approach that creates this whole other pathway that allows people to talk about cultural differences and never name or confront racism. Look, cultural competence is really important, but by itself, it is no threat to racism.
So things like Black History Month, things like the
Yeah.
Lunar New Year celebration, all of those things, people get to eat the food, which is often, well, which can be a step into understanding a culture, but more often than not, it just really is this taste that makes people feel like, oh yeah, I
It
did
also
this
can
without
lead
doing
to more
anything.
stereotypes because it leads people to believe that every Asian person celebrates Lunar New Year, and this is how they celebrate it in this way. Right?
Right.
I grew up in Los Angeles. We had when I was working in Detroit, they had a Cinco de Mayo celebration, which is part of their cultural awareness program. And it was all Tex-Mex. And I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is not Mexican food. Sorry, pardon my language. I mean, I was like horrified. I'm like, this is not Mexican food. Whose freaking culture is this? So it can backfire, you know, which what would be our feast to celebrate Black culture? Everywhere you go, you're getting in trouble. Can't be watermelon. Can't be cornbread and grits. Gorski also says racial equity cannot be achieved with an obsessive commitment to meeting people where they are, when where they are is filled with racial bias and privilege. Equity is neither optional nor negotiable. This is who we are as an organization. These are the values to which we will be held accountable. He says culture is one important equity consideration, but racial identities might inform cultural identities, but racial inequities are not predominantly cultural misunderstandings. Cultural awareness does not fix systemic racism. We cannot fix a problem we refuse to name, he says. If our equity initiatives feature the word culture more than the word racism, you're probably on a detour. If we adopt an approach that obscures racism behind vague nomenclature like cultural competence, you might be off track. Now, I want to personally add one more detour to this list. And that detour is the resistance of allies. First, there are people who should be allies, but end up being obstacles. You can think of people like Clarence Thomas or Herman Cain. But in the workplace, this is a phenomenon that has been studied extensively. So let's talk about something which is sometimes painful to talk about, and it's the queen bee syndrome. In the early 2000s, research on female leaders started to emerge that showed women in powerful positions are more likely than males to express stereotyped views of younger, less powerful women. Female leaders are also often more likely to underestimate the talents and potential of other women, and they unwittingly, without realizing it, throw up obstacles to the success of female colleagues. Now, first, there's this whole problem with the phrase queen bee, right? It's inherently sexist. But the situation it's meant to describe is uncomfortably real. And female leaders do tend to distance themselves from other women, and they adjust their own behavior to more closely match masculine norms. They also tend to endorse and justify existing gender hierarchies. Researchers say this is a response to inequity, not a cause. From the report, I'll read you. It says, queen bees can legitimize the status quo in several ways: by agreeing with negative stereotypes about women, by denying the illegitimacy of lower outcomes for women as a group, by not supporting or even opposing action to address gender inequality. It's been found that women who achieved personal success in male-dominated organizations perceived selection procedures as legitimate even when there were clear signs of gender bias. There is a huge body of work showing that conditions under which women are expected to perform are just less favorable than they are for men. Women are expected to take the primary responsibility for their family, but having success in their careers means they have to prioritize their work over their family, right? Women in leadership positions are more likely than men to be single or childless. And as a result, senior women might feel that they've made all these sacrifices in their personal life, in relationship with partners and friends, in their decisions to have children or not. And it's possible that queen bees distance themselves not from women in general, but more specifically from women who have not yet made the sacrifices necessary to survive in male-dominated organizations. Now, Dr. Jessica Taylor, who's awesome, wrote a piece in The Independent in 2022. And she said this: the world is a horrible but very successful and effective patriarchy, and we are all brought up to live and work in it. Women and girls learn early on that they are in competition with other women and girls. Who's the prettiest? Who's the smartest? There can be only one, you see. And so they're taught to fight for the tiny scraps of power they may be afforded by crushing other women and girls. So let's talk about this. I can say from my own personal experience that the two worst bosses I've ever had were both women. First of all, we could come up with a different phrase for this other than queen bee syndrome, right? But how have you seen this manifest? And again, I want to emphasize that research shows this is a response to inequity, not a cause of it.
Right. But it's still damaging,
Very.
absolutely damaging. I mean, I find it also, if we take it to race, that, you know, we have it as women and then it happens within the Black community too. So
Yeah.
it's almost like it's a double gift that can happen. There can only be room for one.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
we
and
start
then
that though. We start that with classrooms when we integrate classrooms where it's often that we have to split up the Black children so that what if we had all the Black children in one class and then made everybody else work around that? But no, we split it up because we can't have everybody together. So I think that we start that kind of educating or miseducating early.
I would agree with
You know,
that.
there can't be that many smart women. There can't be that many, you know, smart Black people. And then if you're a Black woman, it's even harder because you get hit from all sides. I
I
can't
think
say that I
it's
think Black men are any better at supporting us just because they're Black, or Black women, frankly, are often any better than at supporting us.
I would say, in my opinion, I think it's very likely that someone like Clarence Thomas does more damage than Arlen Specter.
That's a hard one, and you did it.
I think that even going back to the days of Booker T. Washington, I think Booker T. Washington did an incredible disservice to his race.
Yep.
I think he held the race back at a moment when there was a small glimmer of opportunity for progress.
Yeah.
He helped shut that door. That's just my opinion here.
I'm with you on it, by the way.
By giving cover and supporting all of the idiocies of white supremacy. What do you think here, Audrey?
I agree. And I was thinking about the same thing, and I've had two female bosses that were shockingly terrible. And what I mean by that is like literally setting people up to be fired, or thinking of you as as competition for them, instead of finding ways to work together. And then you throw race in there, it's a whole other ball of wax. And I do feel that Black people are worse to each other in many instances than supportive. Yeah.
You see this all the time in all marginalized groups,
Yes.
right? That is what white supremacy and patriarchy tells us they want us to do that.
And then we have the other groups, for instance, in Evanston, we're navigating, you know, Mexican, Black, and how, you know, I mean, and I said to someone, I said, listen, I grew up in an area where it was Puerto Rican and Black, and it was like, that's who West Side Story should have been written about, you know, because it's really so awful, and it remains that way. You know, which is why often when we talk about BIPOC altogether, it's so problematic to me. And I'd love to hear if you have a different take on that so that I can learn something
No.
about it.
First, you talk about it. Tell us why it's problematic.
I think that all of the groups in BIPOC have faced difficulties. I think that it is the patriarchy. I think it is white imbalance that often pits us against each other. But nevertheless, when it's been done long enough, it can still be harmful. And what I find in our community here, it's very funny. There's a group called Evanston Latinos, and they've done great work for their community in a way, but I was talking about it, and my kid said, Mom, you can't just be saying Evanston Latinos. I said, Oh, Martha, it's a group. It's not all Evanston Latinos. It's not, I'm not saying, Evanston blacks, like but and then they understood what I was saying. But it is that the group is coming, every competition comes after anything that Black people have. They don't go after the Asian group, they don't go after the white group. Someone said, yeah, well, low-hanging fruit. It's easier to attack Blacks and to gain traction. It doesn't make it better, though, right? And it's upsetting because in my work, even if I'm at a place that collects and preserves Black history, I just worked on a woman's mural. I worked for every different type of woman to be part of that. The Mexican community as well, saying, please pick your people. And we don't get it back. We don't get it back. And I find myself being frustrated and still not willing to make a generalization, but it's there. Because once I find my way into the generalizations, I'm part of the problem.
That's a great point. Audrey? Any comments here?
What's the question? I'm just listening, thinking that I understand and I relate to it. And I'm thinking about that in the sense of what is happening right now in my world. So, it's a little bit harder to find words right at this moment because things are kind of fresh. But it's really a problem because it's sort of like watching a movie, and while the main protagonist is going on, there's all these subplots. That's how I think of this issue. It's like it just keeps growing legs. You're trying to fight for one thing, trying to fight for equity, and then things are being taken away, removed, and almost as though it doesn't exist. That does not help the situation. It's making things a lot worse. So I think my overall take is for one, the dominant group to think that things can be just swept under the rug or just wiped away by just removing them, is crazy. So to find ourselves in this situation right now that we're in is so nuts. I don't even know how to make sense of this. And I'm not even trying to at this point. I'm not even trying to. I'm just going to see if this craziness, how far it goes, which I'm scared to even say that, before people realize that we're not playing a game. We're dealing with human lives. And we better start thinking about mirroring things, sort of seeing ourselves in each other and taking away all of these other constructs.
I want to play 2 videos for you. One of them because it relates to what we've been talking about all day today in terms of not only what falsely sort of divides us, but also how we might see a pathway forward to creating those bridges. And I actually made this video. I've been trying since the inauguration to make a short video every day with one thing that might be helpful to people. And the second one is just Trevor Noah because it makes me feel good. So first, let's watch this one, which is about racism and labor. Okay. So today we're going to talk about discrimination and prejudice that's a byproduct of capitalism. We're going to talk about the fact that a lot of the divisions we see today, a lot of the hatred we see today was manufactured in order to control our labor. And to do this, we're going to talk about this badass woman, Catherine Dupre Lumpkin. She was a sociologist, a professor, and she wrote a number of books. The one I'm going to be reading from today is called The South in Progress. Look, she was writing in the 1930s, and she was a white woman from Georgia, and some of the language is problematic, but remarkably little She was the daughter of a slaveholder who spent her career writing books to tell the rest of the United States that they were racist and abusive and extractive and inhuman. She also was a lesbian. She had a lesbian relationship with one of her colleagues at the university. But in any case, absolute badass. She is in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. But I want to explain today that a lot of the hatred that we're seeing, the anger, especially from what we call the working class, although it's a little misnomer, like a lot of the things we're seeing are actually a result of the efforts of the wealthiest among us. But let's talk about the working class, because there are a lot of people who are either in the middle class or just hanging on to it with their fingernails, who are angry and frustrated. And that part I 100% understand. The United States at this moment is not designed to help the largest number of its citizens be financially stable. But it has always been designed this way. Even if you go back to the very origin of slavery and, in fact, racism, back to the age when the 1600s, 1500s, when there was no such thing as a white race. People said you were French or you were German. They didn't think of themselves as white. Racism was invented in order to justify slavery. Why was it so important that they be able to import slaves and sell human beings? Was because that was the cheapest possible labor. And when you get to the United States, there was slavery in the North as well. It's just that the North industrialized. It wasn't as fertile a place for agriculture, and so they didn't need slave labor. It no longer became cheaper to try to own people. The South, on the other hand, where cotton was king, it was extremely cheap to own people. You gave them crappy food, a tiny little shack with no insulation, and that's pretty much all of your costs. So from the very beginning, racism, discrimination was always about labor. And they played other groups against one another in order to continue this very cheap labor. I want to read something from Catherine Lumpkin's book, The South in Progress. This obviously is out of print. It was not cheap to find a good copy of it, but you might be able to find one in your library. But let me just read you something here. And of course, she is writing in the 1930s. I think this book was published in 1940. Okay. She says, responsible labor leaders would tell us from their experience that no claim of security for workers is more illusory, more false than that built on a division in labor's own ranks. Why, in a well-organized industry like the building trades, are white carpenters' wages lower in southern cities than in northern? What does a contractor do who wants to bring southern white carpenters to terms? He reminds them that on the other side of town are colored carpenters. We don't use the word colored anymore. This is 1940. They too may be organized in a union, but it's probably a separate union because the white union may permit nothing else. The daily wage rate of the colored unionists, the black unionists, is lower than the white because employers have insisted upon paying black workers less. But why? The white carpenters may have been persuaded to believe their wages would drop to the lower rates of black workers if they didn't stand out for a differential that favored whites. This is, of course, absurd. All the contractor has to do is to keep the white wage down is threaten to hire black carpenters on the job at their lower rate. Ill feeling all around is bred. Who wins by all this? Certainly not the white carpenter union, nor yet the black. Is this what the Southern employer of 40 years ago had in mind when the Southern Industrial Convention, an employers association, sent a representative to address the U.S. Industrial Commission? Black workers, the employer's pronouncement declared, are reserve production capital. In the black labor of the South lies the panacea for the wrongs frequently committed by organized labor and a reserve force from which can be supplied any needed number of workers when the time shall come that they will be needed. The black as a reserve force, they argued, could be used to keep out much of the agitation of labor in the South. The employer must have something to hold over union organization. You see what she's saying here? She, for a very, very long time, in fact, oftentimes still today, people who live in the South make less than those who live in the North. And the reason for this is exactly what she's talking about. Every time workers join together in solidarity to fight for better conditions, fight for better wages, they would say, if you go on strike, we'll just hire these black workers and we can get them cheap. And because they really kept black workers on the edge of starvation, in fact, there are historical records of employers, planters saying exactly that they had to keep them on the edge of starvation in order for things to work properly. Then the black workers would have to accept those wages because they had no other options. And now you have states that are so-called right to work, where they try to prevent people from even joining a labor union. But you see what this is all about. It always has been about employers, corporations, being able to browbeat, bully their laborers through many different means into accepting truly unacceptable wages. That's what it's always been about. So in all this anger that we hear right now over how Americans are not doing well, aren't thriving the way they did in the past. In fact, even this desire to go back to what America used to be. Part of that is the idea that our parents and grandparents were financially more stable than we are now. And that's partly true. And that's not going to be solved by blaming it on immigrants. Frankly, immigrants actually improve the economy. They're a net positive. But by forcing people, by manipulating people, they're not forcing you, by manipulating people into blaming it on others, they never look at the man behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz. And we have to take the blinders off at this point. Like the working class, we can't survive like this, quite literally. And, there's a good argument to be made that the point of AI is just to save employers yet more money, to make labor even cheaper than it already is. And it is disastrously cheap right now in the US. Slavery was about coercing labor. Racism is about controlling labor. It is cheaper, much cheaper for industrialists, corporate executives, whatever you want to call the big employers. It is much cheaper for them to exploit labor than it is to actually deal with organized labor. I mean, Solidarity Forever is about getting enough people gathered together with similar needs that you can in some way balance out the power of those who are the wealthiest and most powerful among us. Right now, that power balance is so off that we don't have a prayer. And to me, that's what really needs to change in the days ahead. Have a good one, and as always, be kind. Okay, so that is video number 1, which I wanted to play because it's really about creating a shared storyline. And am I frozen?
I've been watching some of yours on LinkedIn.
Oh, nice.
I
Thanks.
post
Awesome.
them. I post hers.
Oh, thanks. So I should
You're
have
so
not played
good.
that for you.
No, I hadn't seen that one.
Oh, nice.
So no, it was great. And
Um,
it doesn't hurt to watch it more than once, I gotta say.
so sort of peeling back these layers to help people see what's really going on and help them realize that common ground of that we have needs in common can help create community. And the final thing I will say, and I partly want to play this, and I know this is only a couple minutes long, so we might go 1 minute over. But is because when we talk about the queen bee syndrome, most of the research that's been done in this has been done with white women. We don't have enough of a research basis to know if it's also true in general of Black women. So I just want to play this. This was from Trevor Noah's last show as the host of The Daily Show, and it's what he said to the audience before they started filming. Okay, so here we go. Okie doke.
I remember that. I'm going to post that tonight now. I'm going to post
Yeah.
that.
It's important. It's important to remember as we go forward, especially because a lot of our friends in this space in particular are floundering. And
Mhm.
I'm not trying to downplay it. You know, it was the same when Trump was very first elected, when we saw so many of our white friends have PTSD, like we're literally traumatized. I know we're all tired. I know we've been through this before. I know we have done everything in our power to tell people the right thing to do and to warn people about the dangers. And to have to do this again and again, frankly, I'm writing this book about my great grandmother, to have to see how many times my family has engaged in this work going back to the mid 19th century. And here we are still. I know it's disheartening, but we do have the answers. We do know how to do this. And eventually they're going to listen.
And sadly, the reality is I mean, we can be tired, we can be unhappy, but we can't stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in not being able to stop, many of our people will die earlier than they should,
Yes.
will not get paid what they should, will have their children taken away from them, and will
Will
get
die in
divorced, will
pregnancy.
not be able to live, will not be able to survive on whatever they're paid. You know, it's always like the idea things will get better. Well, not necessarily during this lifetime, but that also is something we've continued to say is might not see it in our lifetime,
Mhm.
but yeah, I hear you.
I don't even
It is,
say that
however,
anymore. I
Yeah.
just say,
pardon?
what's the alternative? The
What did you
alternative
say?
is, I don't even say that anymore because I
Say
don't know
what?
if it'll get better
Right,
eventually,
right.
ever in my lifetime or not in my lifetime. I don't know
Mhm.
that. But the alternative is to sit back and take it like a
There you
turtle on
go.
its back.
Yeah.
And that's no alternative.
Well, the other side of this is thinking about the ancestors and how we're here because they were here. And they didn't have half of what we have, not even a quarter of it. They had nothing. They were stripped of everything. And so I always think if they did this, and I've got all this knowledge and all these resources and blah, 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 I can always say I'm a lot lower than a lot of other people I know that have a lot more, whatever, money, resources, whatever. But I can do this. I always like I can do this. I think sometimes awareness brings more anxiety because now we know all these things. They had to deal with all kinds of oppression and they still had to move forward through this. I love your messages. As you know, I posted you a lot. And I feel like with the passion that you have, it's interesting too, because the more I post about, I don't really love Facebook. Now I'm doing more stuff for work, but very limited, and I don't love it. I never post personal stuff. I just don't do it. But I post stuff like this but here's the thing too. People like if I go somewhere and they love that stuff, but when you post messages like this, they all look because you know how you can tell on your LinkedIn that you have all of these, you'll have like 200 people, but then maybe 3 people like it. You
But
know
they
what I
don't
mean?
like it.
Yeah, they won't like it, but it's getting places because they have all of these ticks. Your message and the way that you deliver it, because the passion is so, you can feel it. Like I just felt like, where's my tissue box? Like so I always go off screen when I'm watching something. But that message, I don't know what we're gonna do, but we're gonna have to find a way to get you like on a larger platform because this is like the best class I've ever. That's why I told Louise, I told my partner's coming. I really want to get you into our office. Like, I don't know who else I've ever heard deliver a message the way you do. I don't know
That's
anybody
really
else.
kind. Thank you.
And I would love, no, I'm not trying to be kind. I'm being honest. I'm just trying to say that this has to go somewhere because you can tell that these are your values. This is not just, you're not just doing a class. This is what you believe. And I remember when you were talking about writing this book when we were in Atlanta, and I was with a friend of mine this weekend and talking about your grandfather. And I need to see if we actually have that on video. I need to see it. I'm not sure. I'm gonna
Oh.
find it. If I do, I'll let you know. But like your message needs to go further than this. Honestly, I don't know how, but I'm gonna figure it out.
And
I,
I have a couple. Oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you.
I was just going to say, I just put a link in the chat and I can play it for you really quickly. But this is my friend, Robert Jones, Reverend Robert Jones, who's a blues player. This song is like, it's
I
got
didn't get anything
everything.
I didn't get anything in the chat.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, it's because I sent it to Audrey only. Hold on one second. Meeting group chat.
Can you play it? Like I can
Yeah,
stay
I'm going to play it right now.
working later tonight. Can you stay, Laurice, and listen to it?
It's only 3
Yeah,
minutes.
I got nothing in my life but this.
Okay. Can you see the Reverend there?
No. Yes, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
Melville told the tale of a preacher who cried, preaching to the men who come in on the tide. They were tired, hungry, and broken inside, and he preached them the blackness of darkness. And their sons and their daughters walked down the same road, never knowing a life without burden or load, but still from their hearts no love overflowed as they lived through the darkness of blackness. Forget not our fathers who hung from the trees. Forget not our mothers who prayed on their knees. For the greatest of us is still lesser than these who live through the darkness of blackness. And our fathers were feared even though they wore chains, feared for their muscles and feared for their brains. For all else is gone, the blackness remains. They taught us the power of blackness. With strong, able women, our fathers were blessed, and their beauty showed through even shabbily dressed. For a queen wearing rags is a queen nonetheless. They taught us the beauty of blackness. Oh, forget not our fathers who hung from the trees. Forget not our mothers who prayed on their knees. For the greatest of us is still lesser than these who live through the darkness of blackness. Fathers built houses by the strength of their hands, to see them burned down by the knights of the clan. They looked up to heaven and built them again, and they fought back the darkness of blackness. And they fought it with sinew, and they fought it with bone, and they fought it together, and they fought it alone, and they fought it with marching, and they fought it with song. They fought back the darkness of blackness. Forget not our fathers who hung from the trees. Forget not our mothers who prayed on their knees. For the greatest of us is still lesser than these who live through the darkness of blackness. And you rise never knowing quite what to respect, and you rise in the morning demanding respect, and you rise in spite of the knee on your neck. We live in the darkness of blackness. And one day when our fathers we meet face to face, blow some sons we addicted, some daughters to face. Let us not have to say when they ask for the race that we fell to the blackness of darkness. Forget not our fathers who hung from the trees. Forget not our mothers who prayed on their knees. For the greatest of us is still lesser than these who live through the darkness of blackness. Who live through the darkness of blackness. Who live through the darkness of blackness.
Wow.
Yeah, right?
Thank you. That was amazing. And you sent it to us. Yes, you sent
Yeah,
it.
the link that's in the chat. He and I've done recitals and concerts together. He's
Really?
phenomenal. Yeah.
Oh my God. Let me save
So
this.
anyhow, I just thought you know,
Thank-
it all helps to be in.
Hi, this is Reverend Robert Jones,
Sorry.
and welcome to the final edition of Blues Chronicles. First, let me thank TrueFire.com for inviting me to come and share with you
Anyhow,
the
let me